a relatively small island in a corner of Europe, or can imagine this. At first, it was deemed even a proper country. Yet it would become the greatest empire in history, the one where, as they used to say, the sun never set. Where did these people come from? How did they begin? What path did they follow to become the England we know today? In this video, we are going to see how England became one of the most influential countries in the world, and why, even though it reached Iran, it could never fully colonize it. Let's start with a small clarification. Our goal in these videos is not to glorify or condemn any side. We are just presenting a historical narrative within the scope of the video and leaving the judgment to you. First question. Are England and Britain the same? Not exactly. There are two islands in Western Europe. One is Great Britain and the other is Ireland. Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, consists of 4 countries: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is a separate country. The flag of the United Kingdom combines the flags of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. London is the capital of both England and Britain. And just so you know, Britain came out on top in both World War I and II, making it one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations with veto power. It's important to remember that it's Britain holding that power, not just England. So, how did this little island turn into a massive empire? Well, before the last ice age, Britain was actually connected to continental Europe, but as sea levels rose, it became separated. Various tribes lived scattered across the land, and those strange stones you might see are remnants from that time. Fast forward to around 700 BC, and the last wave of folks to arrive were the Celts, fierce warriors who roamed much of Europe. But then something huge happened. Around 50 BC, the Roman Empire, which had already conquered most of Europe, invaded Britain. After some pushback, parts of the island were taken over. Modern England became one of Rome's provinces, and London, back then called Londinium, was founded around 70 AD. But at this point, there was still no country called England. The Romans built roads, cities, and even brought Christianity with them. However, the Celtic tribes retreated north and kept attacking the Romans. To protect their territory, the Roman emperor ordered walls to be built, some of which are still standing today. By the 5th century AD, the Roman Empire started to crumble. One story suggests that Roman leaders in Britain invited Germanic tribes like the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes to help defend the island. But things didn't go as planned. Instead of teaming up with the Romans, these tribes took control of the island. Even though they shared similar cultures, they lacked political unity. They pushed out the native peoples, and the Angles and Saxons set up kingdoms in what we now call England, while the Jutes vanished from history. The name England itself comes from the Angles, meaning land of the Angles. By 800 AD, the island was cut off from the changes happening in continental Europe and was divided into several small kingdoms. Then, out of nowhere, Viking raids began. Vikings, seafarers from what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, launched attacks on distant lands using their ships and even reached North America 500 years before Columbus, though they didn't settle there. In the 9th century, the Vikings often defeated the Anglo-Saxons and captured much of Britain. The island was in chaos until the Kingdom of Wessex in the south, led by King Alfred the Great, managed to defeat the Vikings and reclaim the land. By the 10th century, England finally emerged as a kingdom for the first time, with Alfred's grandson becoming its first king. However, even though the Kingdom of England was formed, it remained relatively weak and unimportant until the 16th century. Civil wars, family conflicts, and frequent invasions by Scots, Normans, and even Vikings kept England unstable. Now let's zoom into the 16th century, a real turning point. This was when England began its transformation from a typical kingdom into a global powerhouse. The world around it was also changing rapidly. Around 1500 AD, China was under the Ming dynasty. Russia was starting to become an empire. Iran was ruled by the Safavids, and the Ottomans controlled what we now know as Turkey. In India, the Mughal Empire was on the rise, while in Europe, Spain and Portugal were the 2 dominant powers. European monarchies were racing to discover new lands and trade with India and China. The age of exploration had kicked off. Spain and Portugal were mapping new sea routes, discovering the Americas, and setting up colonies. England didn't want to be left behind. King Henry VII poured a lot of resources into building new ships and boosting overseas trade. One game-changing idea was to mount cannons on ships, laying the groundwork for a powerful navy and trade fleet that would eventually rule the oceans. Then came his son, Henry VIII, who not only strengthened maritime trade, but also made a major decision that would change English history, and even Christianity. His most famous act? Marrying 6 times. Why does that matter? Well, the king was desperate for a male heir, but his first wife couldn't give him a son. The catch was that to get a divorce and remarry, he needed the Pope's permission, which the Pope denied. So Henry VIII broke away from papal authority and declared himself the head of the Church of England, creating one of Christianity's major branches, the Anglican Church. England's Reformation under Henry VIII strengthened the separation of church and state across Europe, making Catholic monarchies like Spain and Portugal pretty nervous. After Henry VIII passed away, his daughter Elizabeth I took the throne, a key figure in English history. Her reign is known as the Elizabethan Golden Age, a time when England thrived in art and literature. Great writers like Shakespeare and Marlowe produced their masterpieces. Meanwhile, England's navy grew stronger, expanding maritime trade and unofficially plundering Spanish and other European ships, sharing the spoils with the crown. Spain, one of Europe's 2 great powers at the time, was furious about the raids and the spread of Protestant influence. In 1588, Spain decided to crush England with an invasion, but it ended in disaster for them. The defeat of the Spanish Armada marked a pivotal moment in English history. Suddenly, the English realized they could compete for global trade and colonies in the Americas, the New World. A new phenomenon emerged, the world's first joint stock trading companies. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter for one of the most significant companies in history, the British East India Company. Initially formed for trade with Asia, it soon became a military and political arm of England. Elizabeth passed away in 1603 without an heir, leading the throne to pass to her closest relative, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. This was the first step toward uniting England and Scotland, which would eventually form the Kingdom of Great Britain. During James I's reign, he granted 2 companies the right to establish colonies in the newly discovered Americas. The first English colony was founded in 1607 at Jamestown, Virginia. Over the next century, 13 English colonies popped up in America, many of which would later become key U.S. states like New York. Meanwhile, the British East India Company became super active in Asia, importing spices, textiles, tea, and silk, which became wildly popular in England. The company was incredibly profitable, and at the same time, the Dutch and French were following similar paths. The 18th century was when Britain wasn't just climbing the ladder of power, it was soaring. The parliaments of England and Scotland agreed to unite their economies, forming the Kingdom of Great Britain. This union prepared Britain to become a global power and expand its colonial influence. In 1739, Nader Shah of Persia invaded India and inflicted a crushing defeat on the Mughal Empire, one of the reasons for its decline. The British East India Company, now more than a trading company, had become a private army. Taking advantage of Mughal weakness, it won the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and took control of Bengal. This was more than just a victory. It opened the door to British expansion in India and South Asia. For example, British merchants, who had to pay silver for Chinese goods and were losing profits, began producing opium in Bengal to trade with China. This trade addicted millions of Chinese people and led to the Opium Wars, a major chapter in Chinese history. The East India Company, now deeply influential in regional politics, signed treaties and waged wars on behalf of the British government. Meanwhile, Britain's rivalry with France intensified. The 2 global powers fought the 7 Years' War in 1756-1763, considered the First World War, battling across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Britain emerged victorious, but at great cost. It gained territories like Quebec, Canada, and Florida, and dominated the eastern coast of North America. The triangular trade system became a key pillar of Britain's economy. Manufactured goods were sent from England to Africa. Enslaved Africans were shipped to the Americas, and agricultural products like sugar, tobacco, and cotton were shipped back to England. This cycle brought enormous wealth to Britain, at the cost of unimaginable human suffering. But Britain's growing colonial and maritime power led to heavy taxation on imports, which fueled resentment in the American colonies. After the 7 Years' War, Britain's debt soared, and it raised taxes on the 13 colonies, including on stamps and imported goods. The result was protest, rebellion, and eventually the American Revolution, which ended in 1783 with the independence of the United States. After losing the American colonies, Britain turned toward Asia, Oceania, and Africa. Explorer James Cook charted much of the Pacific, including New Zealand and Australia, claiming them for Britain. Australia and New Zealand became destinations for British convicts once sent to the lost American colonies. Penal transportation and new settlements continued into the 19th century. Britain also expanded its colonial interests in North America and the Pacific. The 19th century, marked by the Industrial Revolution and the vast growth of colonies, became known as the Age of the British Empire. Steam engines, industrial machinery, textile mills, ironworks, and shipbuilding turned Britain into the world's industrial hub, the workshop of the world. The British government eventually abolished the slave trade in 1807, though full abolition took decades. Napoleon's rise in France threatened Europe, but Britain defeated him in 1815 and seized territories from defeated powers like France, the Netherlands, and Spain. The East India Company expanded its influence, founding Singapore in 1824 and seizing Hong Kong after victory in the First Opium War. India. The jewel in the crown remained under company control until a major rebellion in 1857 prompted Britain to assume direct control. India was valuable not only for its immense resources, but also for its vast population, 200 million people compared to England's 30 million. But by the late 19th century, a new threat emerged: Russia. Russian expansion into Central Asia and the Mediterranean worried Britain, leading to conflicts like the Crimean War, where Britain supported the weakening Ottoman Empire. Britain and Russia agreed in 1878 to keep Iran and Afghanistan neutral, one reason why Iran was never directly colonized. Britain also expanded in Africa, taking Cyprus from the Ottomans and gaining influence over the Suez Canal after its 1869 opening, allowing faster access to Asian colonies. Telegraph cables connected Britain to its colonies worldwide. By the 20th century, Britain was still the leading global power, but new challengers emerged: Germany, the United States, and later, the Soviet Union. Germany's ambitions threatened British colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Britain granted limited self-government to colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to secure loyalty. But rising tensions eventually led to World War I in 1914. Britain relied heavily on imports during the war, and over 2.5 million troops from colonies like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India fought and died for the empire. Britain defeated Germany and its allies, including the Ottoman Empire, and gained territories such as Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, and modern Israel. At its height, the empire controlled about a quarter of the world's land and a third of its population. But the immense human and financial costs of World War I exposed how expensive empire was. Colonies demanded more autonomy. India, for example, sought greater self-rule. The independence of Southern Ireland triggered a domino effect. World War II placed even more pressure on Britain, marking the beginning of the empire's end. Britain, with US support, won the war, but its economy was weakened and its global credibility shaken. After the war, the US and the Soviet Union replaced Britain as global superpowers. One by one, colonies gained independence: India and Pakistan in 1947, Palestine and Israel in 1948, and many African and Asian nations in the following decades. Many of these independence movements were not peaceful. Many nations had to fight for their freedom. By the mid-20th century, Britain had lost nearly all its colonies but sought to maintain relationships through the Commonwealth, an association of countries with shared history and culture, allowing Britain to preserve some influence. Today, Britain is no longer a vast empire, but its influence still shapes the modern world, through the English language, parliamentary systems, and the Industrial Revolution it began. We cannot ignore the darker sides of its history: colonialism, slavery, and the deep wounds inflicted on many nations. Yet we also cannot deny its profound impact on the modern world's structure, economy, technology, and ways of life. For example, the island of Run in Indonesia, which Britain traded to the Dutch about 350 years ago, remains much the same today. But Manhattan, which Britain gained in return, has become one of the world's most important cities. The British Empire transformed transportation, shipbuilding, education, public health, communications, and global connectivity. In the end, with all its complexities and contradictions, the modern world still lives under the influence, both positive and negative, of the British Empire. Thank you for watching. Be sure to share your thoughts and stay tuned for future videos.